and articles in very different areas of philosophy, including causation, a user guide, and transformative experience. And she will be giving a talk on the paradox of empathy. And everyone, I really hope you enjoy this talk, because we're very excited to listen to it. All right, thanks everyone.
So thanks for having me, guys. What I'm going to do is I'm going to give this talk, and this is, I was just talking in the meeting earlier that this draws together some themes that I've already written on and has some new material in it, and is also connecting with kind of larger project that I'm, kind of a multi-year project for me. So I'm interested to hear what you think. All right, so we use our imagination and our memory to prospectively assess our choices and, by extension, to understand who we are and whom we want to become. What I'm going to do today is discuss, in the context of discussing transformative change, I'm going to discuss a kind of paradox that I think comes up, a sort of double bind involving empathy, and in particular involving the way we might empathize with possible selves that could imply a kind of alienation from future possible selves. And this alienation comes up when we face radical epistemic and personal change. Okay, so recently I've argued that there can be problems with relying on your imaginative capacities to envision possibilities for your future self in contexts of transformative change. So if you face a transformative decision, that is a decision involving a choice to undergo an experience that can transform you both epistemically and personally, you can lack a distinctive kind of access to many of your possible future selves. By the way, I seem to be having trouble with my screen sharing, and I'm not sure what the issue is here. Does anybody know? Oh, here we go. It's just delayed. Let's see what happens. Okay. So by transformative choice, what I mean is a choice of whether to undergo an experience that's both epistemically and personally transformative, okay? An epistemically transformative experience is an experience that teaches you something that you couldn't have learned without having that kind of experience. For example, like seeing color for the first time. And it gives you new abilities to imagine, recognize, and cognitively model states. And you learn something new, you learn what that kind of experience is like, and then this kind of endows you basically with opportunities and abilities. Now, this learning, what you've learned, right, involves gaining a special kind of distinctive subjective access, right, to this phenomenon. That's the epistemic part. Now, a personally transformative experience changes you, right, and changes you in some deep and personally fundamental way. It changes a core preference, as I put it. This change in core preference may also have downstream effects by changing how you understand yourself, some of your desires, defining personal properties, and what can change some of your plans and projects. By transformative experience, then, what I mean is an experience that is at once epistemically and personally transformative. Maybe the epistemic shift is so profound that it simply constitutes a personal shift, or maybe there's a causal relationship there. I'm sort of open to different possibilities. I think different kinds of experiences can work different ways, but they need to be both epistemically and personally transformative. And examples that I like involve having one's first child, or gaining sight after a lifetime of blindness. Also, maybe losing certain cognitive abilities can also count as this kind of change. There's lots of others. And in particular, I have a favorite example. My favorite fictional example involves having a chance to become a vampire, right? And the thought is that Dracula comes to you and gives you this one-time only chance to participate in a fantastic, life-changing transformation, right? And those who become vampires say that you should do it. So you investigate the possibilities when you're considering, contemplating this possibility. And they tell you, look, you should do it because it's going to give your life new meaning and a sense of purpose. But they say, unfortunately, it's not something that you can know about until you do it. You have to become a vampire yourself before you can really understand what this new life is that you're going to get. Okay, so the thought is that this sets up a decision problem. And here's a quote from Edna Margaret about this kind of decision. She says, the choice one makes alters one's life project and inner core, right? And the problem comes about when you reflect on how you want to choose, because in this case, you can't assign the relevant value to the outcome of the lived experience of becoming a vampire. I want to illustrate this point slightly differently. It was good we just had a talk on the knowledge argument in the previous session. And I think we can use a variant of the knowledge argument to sort of illustrate this idea sort of more simply, right? So we take Mary, who's lived all her life in a black and white room, having to choose whether or not she wants to leave her room based on what she thinks seeing color would be like. And here I'm not worried about Frank Jackson's Mary, where, you know, Mary knows all the physical facts or whatever. That's actually not, I'm much more interested in kind of practical context where, let's say Mary just knows all the scientific facts we have available to us today. So an individual with all the information, all the kind of propositional information, factual based information that she could have, could still then be missing something. And if someone like Mary has to contemplate whether or not she's going to leave her black and white room, right? She faces a problem because she doesn't know what it's like to see red before she leaves the room, right? But she's choosing whether or not to leave the room based on the kind of impact that discovering what it's like to see color is going to be like. So the problem is then that she can't imaginatively, in an accurate sense, prefigure, right, the nature of what it's like to see red. And in this sense, then she can't prefigure the nature of the lived experience option that she's contemplating, right? And she can't do this in the way that she needs to assign it value. So the assumption here is that there could be costs and there could be benefits to leaving the safety of the black and white room. A lot of it depends on what it's going to be like to for her to see red, and then what the downstream effects would that be, right? And so she faces a problem, which we can frame as like a problem of not being able to build a model, right? There's a value gap here. And so she can't assign values to all the options, all the salient options in the model. And if she can't assign values in the necessary way, then her preferences involving those options are going to go undefined. So the model's incomplete. So a first way to see the issue here is that in these kinds of contexts, we can lack a defined model and lack defined preferences for important choices we want to make. And there's a second part of the problem, right? Because that was the epistemically transformative part. But there's also this personally transformative dimension. And that is that the choice by stipulation is going to change who you are. Maybe not so much in the Mary case, but in the vampire case, that's what's going on, right? It's going to change some of your most basic preferences. Like you become a vampire, you're going to want to drink blood. You're not going to want to spend time out during the day. You might lose your soul. Like these are fairly substantive substantive implications. And the question is, right, if you're making a choice where your new preferences, core preferences, are going to be radically different from your old preferences, right? And there's a conflict there, which set of preferences matters more, right? The preferences of the self making the choice, or the preferences of the self who result from the choice? This is important and it relates to testimony, and I'm going to come back to it in a second. Okay, but before we come back to that, I want to just look at how this can apply in a more kind of real life way. Okay, so we have the model of the value gap problem from Mary, and now I want to move to the more real life case of having your first child. Because here's a slide to kind of illustrate the value gap that I'm trying to articulate. Okay, so now imagine that you're contemplating having your first child. And in an ordinary case, if you're a woman who physically produces a child, you go through a very distinctive and unique process, and you also build a kind of attachment to the child that you produce. And this also happens with fathers, but less obviously so. So I'm just going to focus on female parents for the moment. But this attachment often causes you to value the child's life even more than you value your own. It's called an identity defining attachment, and it's been pretty well documented in lots of cases in psychology. And the thought is that like the way that you experience this new value, or the way that you will experience this new value if you actually have a child, right? In virtue of standing in this very distinct parent-child attachment relation, right, will be an epistemically transformative discovery, right? One that then can also change your downstream core personal preferences. That is, it's going to be epistemically transformative and personally transformative. I'm happy to talk about how I think this arises if anyone wants to explore that, right? But my point is that until you've experienced this life-defining relationship, then you have a value gap, right? Because if you can't know what the experiential nature of your lived experience as a parent will be, and I think you can't, just like you can't know what it's like to see color until you actually see it, then you can't assess the character and nature of this lived experience in the distinctive way that you want to in order to be able to assign values in the relevant sort of way, and therefore to projectively assess what kind of self you become if you became a parent. So the idea is that there's a distinctive problem in certain kinds of transformative cases because our ordinary way of approaching the case, where you projectively put yourself into a future new kind of situation, assign values, form preferences, and then deliberate, right, isn't available to you because we face what I think of as descriptively a kind of epistemic wall. Okay. And in particular, then, we're blocked from doing a distinctive kind of model-based reasoning, where this is a kind of idealization. We don't always do this in practical context as well as we should, but the picture is that when we're engaged in a deliberative process, employing these models, right, we want to generate a forward-looking decision tree representing basically actions and outcomes and values, which will then define our preferences. And then we try to prospectively evaluate our actions by searching through the tree, right, and determining based on our preferences how we're supposed to act. Okay. So now remember that I said there was another part of the problem. This is the problem about being able to kind of see forward in an accurate way. But the further issue here is that you can't, when you're trying to assess these outcomes, there's an interesting way in which this relates to understanding the future self that we are, because the problem is when you lack the relevant information, that you can't choose between your options by prefiguring different possible selves, evaluating those different possible selves in different contexts, and then deciding which one you prefer, right? In other words, this kind of prospective reasoning often comes up when we're choosing first personally in contexts where we're making life-changing choices. In other words, we're making what you might think of as self-involved decisions, not selfish decisions necessarily, but decisions that involve who we are and who we might become. And this can also come up when you're making a decision for someone else, but I'm most interested in the identity case. So what am I talking about? Well, David Bellman, I think, has a really nice way of describing this. He talks about how we try to prefigure the stream of consciousness, right, at different points along, or different moments along the stream. That's the way he must put it. He says, the future me, whose existence matters to me, is picked out precisely by his owning a point of view into which I'm attempting to project my representations of the future. Just as a past me, then, is often picked out by his having owned the point of view from which I'm recovered representations of the past. What this is sort of connecting a kind of perspectival orientation we have to the nature of who we are, in particular related to how we identify and make sense of relationships between past, present, and future selves, as well as merely possible selves. Now, nothing I'm saying here implies that we absolutely have to make our choices in a way that involves projectively assessing the nature of oneself or lived experience. I mean, there are other ways to make these choices. You can flip a coin, or you could do it on some other basis. Or maybe there are moral or social obligations that force us to make a choice sort of independently of what we think the nature of our future life and self is going to be, right? But that's fine. My point is that lots of times in lots of important cases, we really do want to choose in this way, or at least that this is an important element of how we want to choose. And if we do want to choose this way, then we face a problem, right? Because if we can't plan our future as the product of choices that we can make in the way that we want to, in other words, by imaginatively occupying the kind of first person perspective of our future self at the future time, right? Understanding what it would like to live as that self, how much we would, how we would feel kind of emotionally about that self, or maybe even just to kind of prepare ourselves for a particular future, right? Then I think it's a significant loss. We have a problem in the way that we think about both prudentially and epistemically planning and making sense of our future lives, our future selves, and by extension, our decisions. Okay. So what happens then if we can't perform this kind of prospective act in the language that I like, when you can't kind of try in the shoes of a future self in order to assess it, right, is that there's a sense in which you're alienated from that possible self. So you're facing a choice where you could undergo a personal transformation and make yourself basically kind of realize yourself differently from how you realize now, but you can't project yourself into who you're going to become. And in this sense, you're, I think, deeply alienated from that self. And I think this is a problem because when you assess big life choices, like whether or not you want to, like irreversible choices, like becoming a parent or something else, you want to have psychological access in this kind of anticipatory, prefiguring, imaginative way to the relevant possible selves so that you can make the right choice, or at least the best possible choice, right? Okay, so we want to do this. And if we find ourselves unable to do this, then I think we should be concerned. And if you want to hear a little bit, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about an example of why we should be concerned if we can't do this kind of prospective reasoning. So imagine that you are thinking about having your first child and that you don't have one. And you think about it carefully and assess things. And after performing this assessment, you decide, no, you don't want to be a parent. Like, it's just not the kind of thing for you. But then you hear about a big new development. Google has built a computer, a fantastic new computer. They call it HAL, right? And HAL can calculate all of your utilities for you. All you have to do is feed in information about your current mental states and background, right? And HAL will calculate your utilities for all your major life choices for a small fee and access to all of your personal data. Google's usual choice. Might even be free, but you have to give them all your data. Okay, so now we've got HAL, and so you think, well, okay, the right thing to do, I can't imaginatively prefigure the possibilities for myself, but I'm going to go and ask HAL, right? So I go and HAL, you go and consult HAL, and HAL tells you that you can expect a very high utility if you have a child, and a low utility, sadly, if you don't. So he says, no, you've made a mistake, right? You're going to maximize your expected utility by choosing to have a baby, even if you can't kind of prefigure it and you don't know exactly how much, right? This is the thing that you should do, given all the information that I have, and I am the expert in this context. Now, this seems weird to you because you've already performed your own assessment and you think you don't want to become a parent, but HAL's built by Google. Like, HAL's the expert here and has access to all kinds of information about the way that other people who are like you make their choices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then you might feel, well, okay, you're rationally obligated then to go and have a child, even if you can't perform the kind of ordinary kind of assessment that you would in these circumstances. And my point here is that even if it's what you should do rationally to go ahead and have this child, there's a way in which you're alienated from who you're going to become. So you don't think it's in your best interest to become a parent. The expert tells you that it is, given ordinary utility measures of utility assessment. So you're rationally obligated to go and do something that makes you into the kind of person that right now you just don't see as who you want to be, or a natural extension of yourself. Okay. So this is a way of kind of trying to explicate the kind of alienation that I'm interested in, that we could be forced into if we can't use the kind of prospective reasoning that we ordinarily want to, and have to substitute, for example, expert testimony for that type of prospective reasoning. There's another issue. And the further issue comes out when we think a little bit more carefully about, like, what does it mean for HAL to tell you that you'll have a higher utility if you have a child, right? Does it simply mean something like, well, you just don't really have access to your own deepest preferences, right? You just are somehow kind of emotionally blocked or whatever from really accessing what you really want and need, right? You just somehow don't know it. Well, it's not clear that actually is the right assessment. And one reason why, or a way to see this, is to remember that we're talking about doing something where you undergo a transformative experience, where you undergo a change in core personal preferences, right? Because by definition, this means that the experience is going to change who you are. And so this means that what HAL is telling you is not necessarily that you, as you are now, will be happier as a parent. It's not necessarily that somehow your preferences aren't revealed to you, right? It's rather, HAL is telling you that whoever it is that results from your transformation will be happier as a parent, right? Now that's technically speaking you, but it's a different self by definition, right? And this then changes the nature of the decision. That is, right, you have to decide whether or not to replace the self that you are with a new self as the result of a transformation. And this needs to be evaluated differently, right? In other words, you have to decide whether you want your future self to be the same as your current self, a childless self, or whether or not you're happy to trade who you are now for a new self on the basis that new self will testify to being happy and being happier than that old self was. And the way to put this is that this is the context in which there's an endogenous change where a kind of basic presupposition of rational thinking is or decision making is violated, namely that act state independence is violated. So the testimony that you're getting from Hal about what you should do is not distinguishing between a utility value that represents what you now want for yourself, the self that would be at T2, and a utility value that represents what a psychologically alien self that is still a realization of you, the person, but has replaced you at T2 wants for itself. And so this is, the testimony is not going to make that distinction. And in fact, if the testimony that has been gathered is that of satisfied parents, then in fact, it suggests that there's kind of, that the utility value that represents what you want now is just simply not represented by, captured by that testimony, right? Then without the ability to prospect for yourself, to project yourself into these situations and identify or form your preferences on your own, then you lack any basis for making the distinction, right? How are you supposed to answer? That's the problem. How are you going to decide which self wins out? Okay, so this is, what I've just done is described a way of thinking about problems with transformative decision making.
I know, I was planning on doing it upstairs. Is that all right?
And
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just need to grab some more food.
some noise in the background. Sorry, I'll just stop for a second. Okay, so what I've just done is kind of set up the context about transformative experience and transformative decision making, and how there's a kind of background, both metaphysical and epistemological issue here that we have to navigate, right? And I think of it in terms of assessing different possibilities and different counterfactuals and defining and understanding the implication of testimony and preference. But I want to look at something downstream from this. Because I think there's another implication of the way that transformative experiences can involve potential alienation from current selves. Okay, and this one I'm going to explore using the concept of empathy, because empathy is supposed to be strongly connected with understanding the views of others, and when properly moderated, with moral judgment. Okay, and roughly the idea is that when an agent grasps the perspective of the other in some rich kind of cognitive way, right, they're able to kind of know what it's like for another person, or possibly for another self, in a way that can be important both for moral judgments and for other kinds of judgments. Okay, just to kind of motivate this, I think it's kind of conventionally accepted that a very, very strong way to motivate tolerance, in particular for alien points of view, is to argue that you should stand in the other person's shoes, right? You should, or people say, before you judge them, you should walk a mile in their shoes, et cetera. You're supposed to kind of project yourself somehow into the belief and value framework of another person to see their point of view, one might say, in order to evaluate what's going on. Okay, now I just argued earlier that in some contexts, we can't do this. We can't do it for other people, and we can't do it for our future selves. But sometimes it is in principle possible for us to do this. Right? Maybe you've had the right background experiences that you need. Maybe you could choose to have the right background experiences so that you could then form the kind of abilities that are needed to take the relevant empathic perspective. Okay. What is this perspective? Well, again, that involves the exercise of these capacities where you understand or grasp possibilities as part of kind of imaginatively grasping different perspectives. Okay, so again, you try to view the world from the experienced perspective of the individual that you're empathizing with, right? Maybe by kind of partially cognitively modeling or grasping in some other kind of sense the belief and value structure of the other person, the other self. So what matters here is that you perform this task by having an experience, right? You imaginatively kind of try on this other perspective, and that itself is a type of experience. And from having that experience, you learn something, okay? Now, again, usually we think this is an important capacity to have. It could lead to bias in some context. There's an interesting debate in the psychology literature about the role of empathy. But the thought is that when it's done in a cognitively acceptable way, that this brings information and is highly valuable. And also you see a role for empathy in other kinds of literature. For example, in the social choice literature, John Harsanyi argues, quote, the basic intellectual operation is imaginative empathy. And what he's interested in here is like making choices for others or assessing various kinds of opportunities for policy and other and kind of moral assessments, right? He says, look, we imagine ourselves to be in the shoes of another person, and we ask ourselves the question, if I were really now in his position and had his taste, his education, his social background, his values, his psychological makeup, then once you imagine yourself into that position, then you say, oh, now what would be my preferences if I had all of these other background commitments between various alternatives? And you're supposed to use that imaginative projection to learn what the appropriate set of preferences would be or set of choices would be for that individual. Okay, right, so, and more generally, right, here's Bill explaining that it's important, or sort of showing like how important it is, we think, for politicians and doctors and experts and all kinds of authorities in various contexts to be able to kind of projectively empathize in order to then make decisions and understand others. Okay, what I'm interested though in exploring is, even if we do think it's really important to learn about others and to learn about these possibilities through projecting ourselves empathetically into the shoes of another person, right? It could be rationally justified. In fact, you might be rationally obligated to not take that stance. In other words, you can reject empathizing in the relevant way, even though you admit that you're going to learn something really important and essential. Why would that be? And the thought is that there might be a possibility of a certain kind of epistemic threat. The worry is that you could risk a kind of mental corruption by projecting yourself into the shoes of another. Thought is that by allowing yourself to fully imaginatively engage, to have this experience of engaging with the perspective of another, right, could entail a kind of loss of control over how you think and what you care about. Because the experience of grasping that other's perspective could transform in a corruptive way what you care about. And it could transform in a way that right now you don't want to be transformed. You don't sanction that. All right. So example, right, of a transformation that could corrupt your epistemic capacities. Well, think of truly empathizing fully and generously, right, with a paranoid conspiracy theorist. Or consider fully and kind of generously empathizing with a member of a cult, or even someone who's just got a kind of radically different political perspective from what you have. And if you think this is crazy, just come live in the US for a little while, because there are a lot of people who seem to have these kinds of views. And if you want to fully understand their view, and there's kind of, it's quite famously, there seems to be a kind of epistemological impasse between the different sides. If you really want to understand them, you have to be able to kind of project yourself into their shoes. So the problem is that you might think there's a rational obligation to project yourself into the perspective of another in order to get information, right? But at the same time, in some of these contexts, you might think that you're rationally obligated to avoid doing this if standing in their shoes and really experiencing, trying on their point of view, could open to the possibility of a type of cognitive corruption. So the thought is that the experience of occupying the point of view of the other might be a transformative experience that changes the way you think in a way that right now you don't want to be changed. So the thought is there's a kind of distinctive epistemic risk here. And because it's transformative, there's a certain way in which we can't even model that risk for ourselves. I'll say more about that. But this is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the potential for a kind of paradox of empathy. And if that's right, I'm going to give you a case in a minute to kind of explore this in more detail. Then this has implications for how we're to understand tolerance, how we're to understand debate, and also practical implications for how we're going to manage kind of deep divides, both in political discourse and also, I think, in kind of moral assessments. Okay. I also think there's lots of interesting cases, relationships here to self-deception, which if I get a chance, I'll talk about. Okay, now I've been talking about understanding others and the potential for kind of mental corruption if you project yourself into the perspective of another, successfully enough so that you really understand what it's like to be them. And there could be, there's a kind of epistemic risk associated with that. But I think the very same kind of risk, as I just sort of hinted when I was talking about self-deception, can arise when we're thinking about possible future selves, our own possible future selves. Okay, so what do I mean? Well, we can think of our desire to first personally grasp our future perspectives, right, as a desire to share a certain kind of empathetic connection to our future selves, right? I mean, if you want to become, if you're contemplating becoming a new kind of self, like a parent or a vampire, or pick your poison, right? Then you want to know and understand that perspective in order to evaluate it as fully as possible. Either because you want to decide whether to choose it, or maybe even just to prepare yourself. When I say prepare yourself, like I'm interested in cases, for example, people who've been imprisoned for 25 or 30 years, who then are released. Well, they need to be able to, like, there's a real problem there because people can't prepare themselves for what they're going to experience because they can't project out into the outside world to understand how much things have changed. And so if you can't prepare yourself for this kind of transformative change, even if you accept it, you're vulnerable to all kinds of, I think, kind of corrosive influences and problems. Okay. So in the first part of my talk, I talked about how it can be bad to be alienated from these possible future selves. And it's just sort of illustrating how it can be bad. But there's a different conclusion you could come to in some of these contexts, and that is maybe you want to be alienated. In other words, you might desire the kind of alienation that I've been describing from some future selves. Why? Because that alienation preserves you from a kind of mental corruption. You might fear empathetically understanding some of your possible future selves, because understanding that possible self of yours, right, could drive you to become the kind of person that you don't want to be, or might somehow lessen the counterfactual distance between who you are now and this, one might say, undesirable way that you could be. This is the connection to self-deception I'm interested in. It can be productive to be self-deceived in some ways. Okay, so just to recap, I was saying, look, you could be afraid of empathizing with an entirely different person, like a violent or evil or a psychopathic person, because you could worry that it would corrupt you. But in fact, the same kind of fear can arise, and maybe with good reason, with respect to your ability to kind of project yourself into some of your own your own possible future selves. Okay, now, if you think that there can be a context where you don't want to open your mind to the experience of being that self, because having that experience could corrupt the way you think, then I think this is like interesting in itself, and I think it also helps us help us to understand certain kinds of patterns of reasoning, and also really interesting debates between, like, it can help us understand the nature of certain kinds of disagreements. Okay, and in particular, disagreements where it doesn't seem to matter what the evidence is. Like, it's not about, somehow the disagreement does not seem to be affected by the production of evidence on one side or another, right? The suggestion is maybe there's something else going on, and understanding what else could be going on can help us kind of navigate or think about these disputes. So the one I want to think about for a moment to kind of see how what I'm saying would work, and to kind of clarify, I think, the structure of these disagreements involves a standoff between the skeptic and the believer. Okay, in particular with the skeptic about the existence of God, and the believer about the existence of God. So let me talk about that. The idea is the believer exalts, like, in the satisfaction of faith, in the revelation which attends the experience of opening one's mind to God. Okay, and this belief is not arrived at like via some kind of Pascalian approach. It's rather that there's this kind of exercise of a capacity to grasp the divine, in particular to grasp the divine majesty of a supreme being. This is I'm describing this perspective that comes up in kind of theological discussions. The skeptic does not have this experience. Okay, he doesn't see any physical evidence for the existence of God. he thinks, well, look, if there were a God, there would be some evidence, right? Why should one believe in this without any evidence to support the hypothesis? So the skeptic concludes that belief in God is really just a kind of psychological thing that people have to engage in to kind of feel happy or to feel comfortable or whatever. I mean, and they think, and the skeptics is like, well, maybe that's not very rational of the believer in various ways, but sometimes self-deception is legitimate. And so, sure, the believer can take that stance, but he, the skeptic, is not going to engage in this exercise in self-deception. He's the clear thinker, right? In the cold, hard light of day, he looks at the evidence and reasons to the most likely conclusion. Okay. Now, in response, the believer, right, when confronted with this kind of reasoning, argues that the skeptic has missed the point, right? In other words, the claim is, look, skeptic, you're not receptive to the evidence. It's not that there is no evidence, it's just that you're not able to detect it because you're not open to detecting it. And this case is made, right, often by Calvinists and others, and actually there's a number of different in the Protestant, actually there are several different kinds of religions that make this case either directly or indirectly. The idea is that to properly assess the case for or against the belief in God, you have to open your mind to the possibility of divine creation first. And once you've opened your mind in the right way, then you have the capacity to detect evidence that's relevant to this assessment. Okay, so if the believer says this to the skeptic, right, what's the response? Well, I think there's a kind of skeptic that, even if not explicitly, is implicitly rejects this move. The skeptic refuses to open his mind in the way necessary that the believer says is necessary in order to evaluate the evidence. Why? Why would this be the case? And the thought is that, well, why? To refuse to see this perspective, like to refuse to take the believer seriously or participate in the believer's activities, right? It seems intolerant. It seems like there's a kind of refusal that is dangerously close to kind of an irrational response, because the skeptic was supposed to be truly interested in unbiased assessment of both sides of the question, right? And an evidence-based assessment. But if the skeptic is refusing to do what's necessary in order to evaluate the evidence, it seems like it's the skeptic that's engaged in a kind of self-deception and is not the most rational thinker. Okay. And what this suggests to me is that there's something else going on. Okay. In particular, there's a deeper structure to this dispute. And the thought is that to see this, we first need to notice that religious experience of conversion is in fact just the sort of transformative experience that can radically revise your epistemic perspective and personal commitments. If having a religious experience is transformative, as testimony would suggest that it is, then issues concerning alien perspectives and preferences and alien selves may well be involved. So in particular, we could understand the skeptic's response as a rationally motivated aversion to the possibility of self-immolation, right? So the skeptic now is sure that he's right. He doesn't believe that God exists, and he doesn't think that he should believe that God exists. But what's really going on is that he fears that if he truly imagined in this open, engaged way, with the perspective of, if he truly imagined and engaged with the perspective of the believer, right, that this could change his judgment in a way that from his current perspective that he can't sanction. It could corrode his capacities. He's not afraid that in the first instance that he'll gain new evidence that given his current perspectives and his current capacities that he would judge as evidence. He's afraid that having the religious experience would somehow corrupt him intellectually, right? It will change him in a way that will make him psychologically alien to who he is now, to his current self. And maybe that alien version of that of who he is would find what that alien self takes to be evidence to believe in God. But he's not interested in that, right? Okay, this is the possibility. And I want to say a little bit more about like, well, is this plausible? What kind of experience is involved here? And to see how to understand this debate, you could just go to lots of interesting discussions in Christian theology concerning the spiritual experience of recognizing the divine, because in fact, you do see this kind of structure. If we look at for example, the 16th century Protestant theologian's work of John Calvin, right? He defended the existence of what's called the sensus divinitatis, which is a quasi-perceptual faculty, apparently. This sensus divinitatis involves your capacity by definition to know God, okay? And the thought is that once you exercise this capacity, you can gain or grasp God's divine majesty. Plantinga, Alvin Plantinga, following the American theologian and philosopher Jonathan Edwards, describes sensing the divine as analogous to experiencing the world in other sensory ways. And in particular, he draws an explicit analogy to seeing red for the first time or tasting honey for the first time. So Jonathan Edwards described it, sensing the divine, as analogous to like the same kind of experience as tasting honey for the first time. So on this account, we're supposed to have this latent capacity to sense the divine. And then once we bring it into being and exercise it, right, it allows us to experience the moral qualities of God. And through this experience, you're naturally and easily moved to faith. You naturally reflect and develop a belief in God by this reflection. It's not hypnosis, it's not being drugged, right? You reason once you evaluate this evidence. Okay, so on this picture, once you see the kind of psychological and epistemological model that the believer has, right? Then you can understand the reluctance of the skeptic, right? The skeptic is engaging with what's called a kind of pre-commitment strategy, right? Because if manifesting your capacity to engage with the divine is going to lead you non-inferentially and naturally to belief in God, right? Then the skeptic can be motivated to resist this future. He wants to resist any future that involves the real possibility of becoming someone who is not a candidate self for him currently, someone who's basically an alien self. So it's not a kind of refusal to assess evidence straightforwardly, right? It's his rationally motivatable fear of losing his connection to his past selves, right? Remember the Vellman discussion. And a resistance to becoming a future self who's alien to who he is now. Okay, so if that's a way of thinking about the debate, right, then we have a better model for what's going on with this kind of impasse, with this disagreement between the skeptic and the believer. The thought is like, the skeptic isn't just kind of defending the status quo, isn't just merely resisting a change in perspective, right? The skeptic is confronted with an argument that to truly and fairly assess the value of believing in God, he's got to open his mind and allow himself to awaken his sensus divinitatis, right? Like, and you're supposed to do this by embedding yourself in nature and engaging in religious practice. This is the way that the argument works. And by definition, mere definitions of the divine fall short, right? Just like mere descriptions for the uninitiated about what it's like to see red or what it's like to taste honey for someone who's never seen red or had never tasted honey, those descriptions fall short. We just don't have the ability to communicate what's necessary here. You have to have the experience yourself in order to have the ability to fully grasp the divine and detect the evidence of the existence of God. And the trouble is that if the skeptic is deliberating over whether to allow himself to have this experience, right? He can't projectively model how he's going to respond to this experience before he actually has it. He has to just have the experience and then discover what it's like. So then he's supposed to decide whether or not to have the experience of allowing himself to sense the divine without knowing what to expect. But if he risks opening his mind in this way, by his current lights, what he's doing is risking losing control of the way that he thinks and of his preferences and his capacities and becoming someone who's psychologically alien to who he is now, right? In particular, he risks becoming someone who thinks very differently about the fundamental nature of reality, right? Who evaluates experience very differently from how he evaluates it now, right? And he finds this perspective to be basically cognitively alien to his current perspective, right? And remember, we're not talking merely about an epistemic transformation here. We're talking about like being spiritually reborn. So it's very clearly supposed to be a personal transformation as well, right? So the thought is that this risk of losing permanent control of who you are now is why the skeptic refuses to entertain the perspective of the believer or to explore the possibility of actually awakening the sensus divinitatis in order to then evaluate the evidence from the believer's position. Now, I've just done this in terms of like the skeptic versus the believer, but we can swap it around. The believer has the same problem, mutatis mutandis, right? The believer who's repulsed by the forlorn existence of the skeptic could refuse to project themselves into the view of the skeptic because they would worry that this would also be kind of cognitively corrupting in a way that they could not recover from, okay? So the thought is, first, as I've said, that this can give us, I think, some insight into certain kinds of standoffs between and certain kinds of disagreements where one of the puzzles is it's just not about the argument or about the evidence in some straightforward way. The debate just can't move forward in the way that you would think it should if it was about rational individuals evaluating evidence. And then the second thing that I'm actually interested in, which is a little bit orthogonal, is how actually this question, the way that I've been exploring this particular example, brings out how religious experience actually has a lot of epistemological and metaphysical themes. So remember the biblical story of Eve, who angered God by tasting the forbidden fruit from the tree of knowledge. This should remind you of the knowledge argument, right? Like the thought is that, well, look, there's this kind of fear of experience and corruption of faith that comes up in these stories, right? That relates to the fear of experience and intellectual corruption that I've been describing in the terms of like, oh, that could be present for the skeptic or maybe for the believer, right? And this gives us an interesting, I think, connection between like contemporary debates in epistemology and philosophy of mind and the metaphysics of selves to like ancient Western cultural themes of the connections between like religious experience and knowledge and discovery. And so this kind of orthogonal thing is also something that I'm quite interested in. Thank you.
All right.